It doesn't feel like coincidence. A father and son, both rising stars, both cut down before their time, and both surrounded by questions no one can fully answer. Bruce Lee, the martial arts legend, died in the summer of 1973. His son Brandon would die in the spring of 1993, almost exactly 20 years apart. Two tragedies, two eerily similar stories, and one family name that still echoes through Hollywood like a ghost. Some believe the Lee family was cursed. Others say the truth is far more grounded and far more disturbing. But one thing is certain, Brandon Lee's death was not just a freak accident. It was the kind of moment that makes people stop and say, wait, that can't be real. But it was. Before we even begin to untangle the mystery, let's look at the moment it all fell apart, the scene that changed everything. Because what happened next wasn't a stunt. It wasn't a mistake that could be brushed off. It was something no one on set could ever forget. And it started with one trigger pull. The cameras were rolling. The lighting was perfect. Brandon Lee, dressed in dark makeup and a long black coat, walked into the scene like he'd done a dozen times before. It was a simple moment in The Crow, the film that was meant to make him a star. His character enters a room, a thug pulls a gun, the gun fires, cut, reset, move on. Except no one called cut, because this time, when the gun fired, Brandon Lee collapsed and didn't get up. For a few seconds, no one moved. The crew thought he was acting. Maybe he was improvising, but Brandon didn't speak. He didn't blink, and the blood pooling around him was real. There was a silence on set that no one would forget, a kind of stunned confusion where everyone waited for someone else to step in, but no one did. And by the time they realized what had happened, Brandon was already slipping away. The question now was simple. How did a fake gunfire scene end in real death? The answer lies in the chaos that unfolded right after the cameras stopped. The crew rushed in, finally realizing this wasn't part of the show. Brandon wasn't acting. He was unconscious, bleeding heavily from his abdomen. Emergency services were called. He was quickly taken to a nearby hospital. But what no one could figure out in that moment was how. How does a blank-firing prop gun suddenly become deadly? It turns out the weapon used in the scene was a real handgun. It was supposed to be loaded with blanks, fake cartridges that produce a flash and sound without a projectile. But something had gone horribly wrong. Somewhere along the line, a live round, or something very close to it, had ended up in the chamber. Investigators would later discover that the gun had been improperly cleaned after a previous scene. A dummy round, which looked real but wasn't supposed to fire, had become lodged in the barrel. When the blank was fired, it had just enough force to push that lodged piece forward, straight into Brandon's stomach. It was an accident. That's what they called it. But when you look at how many things had to go wrong for this to happen, accident starts to feel like the wrong word. And the worst part, it might have been preventable if anyone had realized what was really happening before it was too late. Here's the haunting truth. When Brandon was shot, the cameras didn't stop. They kept rolling, capturing every second of what looked like a powerful, emotional scene. Because no one realized it wasn't a scene at all. The actors stayed in character. The crew followed the script. Brandon's collapse looked so convincing, no one questioned it. But behind the lens, reality was falling apart. By the time the director yelled cut, Brandon was already unconscious. Precious minutes had passed. The delay in realizing the danger cost valuable time that might have made the difference between life and death. Later, some of the cast and crew would say they were haunted by that moment. The footage exists. It was never released. But the knowledge that it's out there, that somewhere Brandon's final living moments were captured on film, is something many in Hollywood can't forget. He was still breathing when they carried him off set, but barely. And by the time he arrived at the hospital, the fight to save him was already slipping away. Doctors worked on Brandon for hours. He went into surgery almost immediately. The bullet had torn through his abdomen, damaging multiple organs. Blood loss was severe. Despite all efforts, Brandon Lee was pronounced dead at 1:43 in the afternoon. He was 28 years old. The cast and crew were devastated. The production shut down. News of Brandon's death hit headlines around the world within hours. But fans weren't just shocked. They were confused. How could this happen on a professional movie set in the 1990s? How does a real bullet end up in a gun that's supposed to be safe? And more than that, how is it possible that Bruce Lee's son died during the making of a movie, just like Bruce did? The tragedy was real, but so were the questions. And as investigators looked deeper, they found something no one expected. A bullet, a real one, in a prop gun. And the explanation made the tragedy even harder to swallow. The official report pointed to a shocking combination of negligence and oversight. A dummy round used for close-up shots had been improperly made. Its casing was removed, but the bullet tip was still intact. When it was fired earlier during a different scene, it lodged silently inside the gun's barrel. No one noticed. Days later, when a blank cartridge was loaded for Brandon's big scene, the force was just enough to propel that hidden bullet like a real one, straight into his body. In the world of film production, that's what's called a squib load. It's rare, extremely rare, but not impossible. Still, the bigger question remained: how could a major Hollywood set let this happen? The firearms expert had already left for the day, the crew was behind schedule, corners were cut, safety protocols weren't followed, and someone, maybe several someones, signed off on a gun they hadn't inspected. In court, it was ruled an accident. No criminal charges were filed. But to this day, many believe that someone should have been held responsible, because what happened next made it all feel even more cursed. 28 years old. That's how old Brandon Lee was when he died. The same age Bruce Lee was when he filmed his breakout movie, The Big Boss. The same age Bruce was when he began changing cinema forever. Brandon wasn't just following in his father's footsteps. He was walking the exact same path. Martial arts, acting, a cult fan base, and a film that was supposed to launch him into legend. But he never got the chance to enjoy it. Just like Bruce, Brandon died before his movie was released. Just like Bruce, his death came out of nowhere. And just like Bruce, Brandon's final performance would become a haunting symbol of what could have been. Some fans started to point out other similarities. Both Lees were reportedly working under extreme physical stress. Both had troubling dreams shortly before their deaths. Both passed away under mysterious, almost cinematic circumstances. And both left behind movies that would define their legacy. The deeper you look, the harder it is to ignore. Is it just coincidence? Or something far more chilling? When Brandon signed on to The Crow, he was finally stepping out of his father's shadow. For years, he struggled to prove he was more than just Bruce Lee's kid. He had trained in martial arts since childhood, but wanted to be seen as a serious actor, one who could do drama, emotion, and action all at once. The Crow was the perfect role. Dark, poetic, violent. Brandon threw himself into the part. He performed many of his own stunts. He lived on set. He gave everything, and it showed. Early test footage stunned producers. Executives were already eyeing him for major roles. He was about to go mainstream. Big budget studios were calling. Offers were being made. This was it. His breakthrough, but he never got to see it happen. Brandon died just days before filming was set to wrap. All he had to do was finish 3 more scenes. Instead, the role that was supposed to launch his career became his final goodbye. And the movie itself, well, things only got darker from there. The production of The Crow had been plagued with accidents from the start. A carpenter was severely burned. A crew truck mysteriously caught fire. A stuntman broke several ribs. Another was impaled through the hand. One day, a disgruntled crew member drove through the set with his car, narrowly missing several people. And then, of course, Brandon was killed. The filmmakers tried to move forward. They rewrote the ending. They used stand-ins and early CGI to complete Brandon's scenes. The final product was haunting, stylish, moody, and soaked in pain. But the rumors began almost immediately. Some whispered about a curse. Others said the role itself, Eric Draven, a man who returns from the dead, was too close to the edge, too dark, too real. Brandon had poured his soul into that character. And when people watched The Crow, they didn't see an actor playing a ghost. They saw a ghost playing himself. And that ghost looked eerily familiar. Brandon never tried to become Bruce Lee, but in the end, the parallels were impossible to avoid. Bruce Lee died during the filming of Game of Death, a movie in which his character fakes his death, only to be targeted by assassins. At the time, people joked about how close the film came to real life, but no one's laughing now. Brandon Lee died filming The Crow, a movie in which he plays a man murdered on his wedding day, only to return from the grave. 2 fictional deaths, 2 real ones, both captured on film, both surrounded by chaos, mystery, and tragedy, and both leaving behind one terrifying thought. What if it wasn't an accident? Because when lightning strikes the same family, twice, it stops feeling random and starts feeling personal. When people first started comparing the deaths of Bruce and Brandon Lee, it seemed like a stretch. 2 tragic events, decades apart, connected only by grief and legacy. But the more details that surfaced, the harder it became to dismiss. Bruce collapsed suddenly while dubbing lines for Enter the Dragon, complaining of headaches and seizures, only to die a few hours later with no definitive cause. Brandon died from a gunshot wound that shouldn't have been possible. Both were in peak physical condition, both were on the brink of career-defining success, and both were working on films where death played a strange, central role. Even the timing was was uncanny. Bruce died in the summer of 1973 and Brandon in the spring of 1993, exactly 20 years apart. Some noticed that Bruce's film Game of Death included scenes eerily similar to the way Brandon actually died. A prop gun used in a fake death scene becomes part of a deadly setup. It all began to feel scripted, like some unseen hand had already written the final act. These weren't just eerie coincidences, they were puzzle pieces, scattered across time, drawing a picture no one could explain. And as those pieces came together, the whispers of a cover-up started to get louder. In the weeks after Brandon's death, the production company behind The Crow was faced with a brutal decision: shut everything down out of respect for Brandon, or finish the film using stand-ins and digital effects. They chose the latter. Money was at stake. Release dates were locked. Marketing had already begun. But behind the scenes, questions were piling up that no one seemed eager to answer. Why was a real gun used at all? Why wasn't the firearms expert on set that day? Who cleared the weapon? And why did it take a full 30 minutes before Brandon arrived at the trauma center? Studio representatives offered condolences but avoided specifics. Investigations were launched but quietly closed. No one was charged. No one was fired. Eventually, the set resumed filming and the story faded from the headlines. But to those who knew Brandon, it felt like Hollywood had swept something under the rug. An accident maybe, but one that should have never happened. Some believed the negligence bordered on criminal. Others suspected deeper motives. After all, Brandon's death wasn't just tragic, it was cinematic. And for some, that was too perfect to ignore. As rumors spread, a darker theory began to take shape, one that had less to do with accidents and more to do with bloodlines. The idea of a family curse sounds like something pulled from old folklore, a tale passed down to keep children afraid of crossing invisible lines. But in the case of the Lee family, the word curse wasn't whispered in myth. It was spoken out loud by friends, fans, and even scholars. In traditional Chinese superstition, it's believed that some families are haunted by ancestral misfortune, especially if spiritual rites are ignored or legacies are disturbed. Bruce Lee, according to some accounts, had been warned about disturbing old energies when he moved to the West and altered his name. His birth name was Lee Junfan, but he began using Bruce, a Western name, while teaching martial arts to non-Chinese students, something that was heavily frowned upon by traditionalists at the time. Some elders believed he had offended ancient spirits. After Bruce died, those same whispers resurfaced when Brandon entered the spotlight. Fans who believed in the curse said Brandon had inherited not just his father's looks and talent, but also the shadow that followed him. When Brandon died in a freak accident eerily similar to Bruce's fictional film scenes, many felt the curse had claimed its second life. And while skeptics dismissed the idea, others couldn't help but wonder, what if the Lee family really had been marked? Before Bruce Lee died, he reportedly told close friends about a recurring nightmare. In it, he saw himself lying in a coffin, surrounded by a strange fog. He spoke about feeling pursued, as though something was watching him from beyond the edges of consciousness. He even filmed a scene in Game of Death where his character fakes his own demise to escape a deadly conspiracy, only to be hunted down and nearly killed for real. Decades later, Brandon was said to have had similar feelings. Friends noticed he had grown quieter during the final weeks of filming The Crow. He was deeply immersed in his role, emotionally drained and at times unsettled. He once told a crew member that he felt off, like something was out of alignment. One story claims he had a conversation with his fiancée about whether he'd live to see their wedding. It sounded like dark humor at the time, but after the accident, those moments took on a new weight. Had Brandon felt something coming? Were the dreams of his father not just superstition, but warnings passed down like smoke through generations? If they were, no one was listening. And by the time the signs made sense, it was already too late. The official story is clean on paper, an accident, a rare one, the result of miscommunication and technical error. But for those who followed both Bruce and Brandon's lives, the answers never felt satisfying. Bruce's cause of death was labelled a cerebral edema, but no single cause was ever fully agreed upon. There were theories about allergic reactions, stress, even poisoning. None of them ever confirmed. Brandon's death had more paperwork, more witnesses, more evidence, but still, the central question remained unanswered. How could something like this happen, with all the protocols in place? Why was safety taken so lightly on such a high-stakes film? And why did both father and son, two men in their prime, die at the very height of their potential under such strange cinematic circumstances? These aren't just questions for the sake of curiosity. They're the kind that keep people up at night, that send fans digging through interviews, autopsy reports, behind-the-scenes footage, because when you strip away the headlines, the awards, and the movie posters, you're left with something raw and unsettling. 2 men died, both too young, both in front of cameras, and both surrounded by silence where there should have been answers. When The Crow was finally released, audiences didn't just see a performance, they witnessed a ghost frozen in time. Brandon Lee's final role became more than just a movie, it became a memorial. The film was praised for its gritty beauty, its raw emotion, and its haunting tone, but no one could separate the art from the tragedy. Every time Brandon appeared on screen, it felt like watching someone walking between 2 worlds. The film's dark atmosphere, already laced with themes of death, vengeance, and rebirth, now felt painfully prophetic. People didn't just cry because the story was sad, they cried because it was real. Critics praised Brandon's performance as deeply human, filled with pain and grace, a career-defining moment that came too late. Fans left theaters in silence. What should have been his beginning became his end. And in that twisted irony, the movie itself took on a cursed reputation. The Crow became a cult classic, but its legacy was permanently tied to loss. It couldn't be watched without remembering what had happened. And as the years went on, people began to wonder if it should have ever been finished at all. Time passed, but the questions didn't fade. If anything, they grew louder. Forums, documentaries, podcasts, people kept revisiting the deaths of Bruce and Brandon, digging into every detail, every contradiction, every overlooked clue. Conspiracy theories spread like wildfire. Some claimed Brandon had been targeted, others believed Bruce had been silenced. A few even suggested the two were never meant to achieve lasting fame, as though the world couldn't handle the force of their presence. But underneath all the theories was something much simpler: grief. Fans couldn't let go because they had loved these men, followed them, grown up watching them fight villains and defy odds. Bruce represented strength and discipline, a symbol of cultural pride and rebellion. Brandon represented promise and potential, a second chance to carry that torch. And both were taken before their stories were finished. To let go would mean accepting that their deaths were meaningless, and no one wanted to believe that. So fans kept asking, kept watching, kept remembering, and with every passing year, the legend only grew darker. There are celebrity deaths that shock people, and then there are the ones that never fully leave us. Bruce and Brandon Lee belong to the latter. It's not just because of how young they were, or how talented, or how sudden their deaths felt. It's because of how unnatural it all seemed. Their deaths didn't feel like part of the script. They felt like someone had ripped the pages out halfway through the story. And maybe it's that unfinished feeling that lingers. Bruce Lee was a force, not just of cinema, but of identity. He gave people something to believe in. He broke stereotypes, fought for representation, showed the world what was possible. Brandon was the continuation of that idea, a next chapter filled with new energy, new pain, and new art. But both were silenced before their voices could echo the way they were meant to. There's something deeply unsettling about seeing a family line stopped cold, not by age or illness, but by violence and mystery. That's what haunts us, not just the death, but the silence that followed it, the unanswered questions, the potential left behind. The Lee family name was carved into history through discipline, passion, and talent, but its legacy was sealed in tragedy. Bruce didn't just change movies, he changed the world. He inspired millions, opened doors, and broke barriers that had stood for generations. But in the end, his story ended not with applause, but with a quiet death on a borrowed bed, his future erased in one heartbeat. Brandon carried that legacy like a weight and a blessing. He was the son of a legend, but he was never just a shadow. He had something unique, something vulnerable. In The Crow, we saw a glimpse of who he really was. Angry, hopeful, broken, full of fire. That was his introduction to the world. And tragically, it was also his farewell. Together, Bruce and Brandon's stories don't read like biographies. They read like tragedies, like myths. Father and son, lost in the same storm, years apart but forever connected. And for the people who love them, that legacy isn't just about movies or martial arts. It's about the cost of greatness. Maybe it was just an accident. Maybe Bruce had a reaction no one could have predicted. Maybe Brandon was the victim of 1 in a million negligence. Maybe all the similarities, the symbols, the timing, it was all just chance. That's the easy answer. But then again, maybe it wasn't. Maybe there was something else at play. A curse, a cover-up, a pressure that pushed too hard for too long. Or maybe some stories aren't meant to be solved. Maybe they're meant to be remembered. What really happened to Bruce and Brandon Lee may never be fully known. The reports say one thing, the fans believe another. But the truth is, they both left this world with more questions than answers. What's undeniable is this: 2 lives were lost, too soon, under circumstances that still don't sit right. And maybe that's why we keep coming back. Because deep down, we all feel like this story isn't finished.